Raoul Wallenberg was sent to Budapest in July 1944, it was a very special mission. He was sent by the Swedish government on a mission initiated and detailed by the American government. And his sole task was to save as many Jewish lives as possible. This was a diplomatic mission, but he had total freedom to do what he wanted in order to save the Budapest Jews. He had a lot of money and had a lot of freedom. And as he was quite young, when you look at his picture, you think he's older than he really was. He was only 31 when he arrived in Budapest. And he was there for only 6 months. One of the things he did was to issue so-called Schutzpasses, the protected passports, which was more or less his own invention. Other embassies and legations had more or less the same kind of papers, protected documents, but Wallenberg's document had carried greater weight because it had a photograph of the holder of the passport, it was signed by the ambassador and so on. This document, this protected passport, made the Jew in question a Swedish citizen, which was against all international laws, but it was accepted by the Hungarian government. This was one of the most important actions that he took in Budapest, the one he's most famed for. But I would like to stress another part of his program, which is equally important. After the Arrow Cross coup in October 1944, he bought a lot of food, enormous amounts of foodstuffs, which he stored in storerooms all over Budapest. Bacon, fat, flour, whatever you like, tomato paste, pasta, in order to keep the inhabitants of the ghettos alive. Also, what distinguished Wallenberg from the other rescuers, there were quite a few rescuers in Budapest at the time. The Red Cross, for example, the Swiss embassy, who did a lot of things for Budapest Jews. But what was characteristic of Wallenberg's effort was that he was constantly present on the scenes of crime. That may have been because he was younger than most of the other people, but also because he had this feeling of despair, that he had to do something to save these people. The interesting thing with Wallenberg is that he has no prior history of, any particular interest in the Jewish question or in humanitarian questions. Something happened to him in Budapest. Psychologically, one can perhaps explain that in the following way. Before the war, he had, as a member of one of the richest and most influential Swedish families, banking families and business families, tried to get employment within the family empire, was rejected by the family. He had obvious qualities as a businessman, but he was not allowed to show them. When he came to Budapest, he showed these extraordinary organizational skills. He built an organization consisting of various offices all over Budapest, taking care of housing question, food question. He set up hospitals in these houses. All in all, he proved himself to be an extraordinary negotiator and an extraordinary skillful organizer. And that was probably one of the reasons why he had such a success. I think he impressed the Germans and Hungarian authorities by these skills, by the fact that he was never afraid. He was daring. He took risks that perhaps an older person wouldn't have taken. One of the reasons of his success, I think, is that he was not a professional diplomat. He was not tied by the traditions of diplomacy, and he was quite, criticized by these professional diplomats, because after all, his actions, were, they were good for the Jews, but if everybody all of a sudden is a Swedish citizen, who then is a real citizen, right? From a diplomatic point of view, the skilled diplomats would say, well, this is a dangerous game, We support the way you try to help Jews, but there are also, may create difficulties for people who are not Jews, but are Swedish citizens. as we know, he was educated in the United States. Not only that, he spent 3.5 years in the United States educating himself to become an architect, which is quite interesting. This means that he had a creative side to him. He had always wanted to become an architect. And the first evidence I found is from when he was 13 years old, and he had this very intelligent grandfather who took care of his upbringing. He understood that, he should let Raoul become an architect. The ultimate goal was that he should be a businessman, but he understood that in order to make him happier, let him be an architect and then continue. He was very young. He was so, intelligent. He finished high school a year before the other people. So he was an architect at the age of 22, 23. I think that he liked very much the American spirit. He's described as being very American when he was in America. He went hitchhiking. He went through the American states. He hitchhiked all from Michigan to California, and then he went down to Mexico. And he was robbed once by and he seemed to have liked this way of living. And his grandfather actually was much an old man. He said, "Well, that's a good way of traveling, young man, to hitchhike. You'll get to know the country much better than that way." And he was also told, that's just quite an interesting detail, never use your name as Wallenberg, never use your name. Let people understand that you are intelligent, but never use your name. Never stay in expensive hotels, right? Don't pretend that you are anything yet. If you are Wallenberg, you have to prove that you are a Wallenberg, right? It's quite possible that, an extreme situation like the one in Hungary in 1944 demanded a person which was unconventional in his way of looking at the problems, how to solve problems. I mean, I think he spent perhaps 2 days at this foreign office in Stockholm just studying some documents before he went to Budapest. So when we say Swedish diplomat, the famous Swedish diplomat Raoul Wallenberg, well, he was a diplomat because he had a Swedish diplomatic passport, but of course he was not a diplomat in any sense of the word, right? He was not diplomatic, and he was not a diplomat. He was a very skillful. He had been known as a very skillful negotiator, even as a very young man, when he was 22, 23 in South Africa. He was known, in letters of recommendation, saying that he was enormously skillful as a negotiator and as a businessman. So obviously, here he found a problem that had to be solved, and he did it in a brilliant way. That's a good ending.